Hello everybody, my name is Crimsy and man, oh man, buckle up people, because we have a lot of stuff to unpack in this week's video. You might have heard of this art challenge before. It's been all over the internet for over a decade, and it's called the Draw This Again challenge. Basically, all you have to do is pick up an old artwork of yours and redraw it to see how much you've progressed over a certain period of time. Simple enough, right? Well, truth is, I've been meaning to do this challenge ever since I heard of it back in 2010-ish. So
2,000 years later.
Now I'm finally doing it. I decided to go with this Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask piece that I did back in 2012. Back then, I was very proud of the piece, and 6 years later, somehow I think I can manage to improve it. So enough foreshadowing, let's jump into the art of it. First, mood boards. The first step to every project is, of course, to get an idea. Do not underestimate the power of inspiration and research, because inspiration leads to wanting to make research about a topic, and research leads to even more inspiration. That's where mood boards become your best ally in every project you want to undertake. A mood board is essentially a board of images that tells you the mood you're trying to obtain in your piece. It can be art that inspires you conceptually, visually, or technically. You may also include references for specific poses or architecture, or even art techniques that you're trying to replicate. But remember, inspiration does not mean copying. You are entitled to inspiration, not stealing. For this project, I made two mood boards, one for the general aesthetic and one for general Majora's Mask and environment references. Next up, we have thumbnails. Once you're all prepared and comfy with a warm cup of coffee and tons of cool references, it's time to put your mind into work. This step is probably more vital to your piece than any others because of how much it will actually impact your final result. Technically, thumbnails are tiny, much simpler versions of what you want your final illustration to look like. My method for them is simple. I took the polygonal lasso tool from Photoshop and just went on creating basic shapes with it in grayscale. The general rule for environments of all kinds is that the more an object is far from the viewer, and the paler and less detailed it will get. This is partly due to the atmospheric fog that is present in the atmosphere and the distance blur naturally occurring in your vision when observing far-off objects. The values within your piece then become very important to help players stand out from each other and focus the attention of the viewer towards the center of attraction within your drawing. Try to arrange those values in a way that doesn't make them too similar to each other, otherwise the eye won't be able to understand the depth of your image. Sure, this step will take several iterations. In my case, it took way too long. It took me nearly 5 hours to do my 4 thumbnails, and to be honest, that's not really acceptable. This step is supposed to be quick and done without overthinking it. Think of it as throwing out ideas on paper and offering yourself options to choose from, usually resulting in a way better, more thought out and composed piece than your first draft looked like. This last step regarding thumbnails is optional really, but ask for feedback. Your peers may not all be artists, but they will offer a fresh outlook on things you may have not considered at first. That, and if you're a forever indecisive artist like me, asking people to vote on which thumbnail is the best may help you with your final decision. Let's move on to sketching. So once you feel confident with your chosen thumbnail, you can move on to the sketching phase. Again, this one has been a bit of a weird experiment for me because I began sketching out the forest and then went, nah, I want to try lineless art for this piece. Which, in retrospective, was really dumb to try out an art style that is totally new to me and what has to be the biggest illustration I've ever attempted. All of that because I drew a lineless eye before and was dumb enough to think I could apply what little I learned from it to an entire piece with 4 levels of depth, a full-bodied character, and a giant screaming moon. Sometimes even I don't get my decision-making process. So when I was done sketching the forest, Skull Kid, the moon, and the village, I began blocking the values by separating the different layers of depth inside their own folders so I could make sure I could work on them individually if needed. Next up, we have the detailing process, or the polishing phase, if you'd prefer that. To be honest, the real fun begins when you get to really put your mind into a state of flow and just draw. Or, in this case, attempt to paint a lineless screaming moon with almost non-existent painting skills. Anyway, I think most artists love this step because polishing art is just so satisfying. And as much as I'd want to say that going lineless was a bad idea, I actually learned a ton about color mixing and shading by just doing it. And I'll be honest, I love the final result. I think it turned out pretty good, but the hysterics is the time it took me to get to that point. That was the ridiculous part. And that's why I would suggest to anybody out there, if you're trying out a new painting style, just start small and grow from there instead of jumping from drawing a single eye on a white canvas to making a complex illustration just like I did. So once I was done with the moon, I moved on to drawing the village, which I don't know if you ever tried drawing fire, but I think it's the one thing I iterated the most in order to have it look good. I ended up duplicating it and putting the second layers blending mode on screen, adding some glow, some sparks, and I also added some gray smoke between the buildings to help make the distance between them more noticeable. At this point, I was also made aware that my town did not have any memorable elements referring to the Zelda game. So, in my haste, I went on and added the main monument that came to my mind, obviously the clock tower. And I went on to add a couple festival posts here and there. It might be just a little touch, but I think it was most needed and added a lot more credibility to the whole area. Oh, and I also proceeded to draw a wall behind the town, which is collapsing from the imminent lunar impact. Isn't that a beautiful sight? Also, you have to excuse me for not being able to show every step of the way. I'm really trying to make a condensed version of the steps I went through because I think, like I said, it could be helpful to people starting out. This is by no way a tutorial, and it's more of a behind the scenes regarding how I work and do things more than anything else. So, moving on to the foreground. The trees in the background made me struggle the most, I think. Being the closest area to the viewer, it had to be much more detailed, and it was at that point where I started feeling really overwhelmed by the amount of work it would require to look great. But still, I kept going with the lineless workflow and used it on the grass here and on the rocks and roots, and also the middle trunk. I think my favorite part by far was just drawing the moss. It was so satisfying and relaxing for some reason, and I just really had a good time polishing this area. Eventually, I got tired of working on the foreground, and I decided to clean up Skull Kid's sketch and finally draw his final line art. Considering the time I put on him, I might as well upload an entire time-lapse dedicated to him, and maybe I will. But I want to include him here as well, since he's part of the whole process after all. After his line art, I added flat colors to the whole character, and then I moved on to the shading and polishing of his mask, which, let's be honest here, it's the most important part. That's the most iconic symbol of the whole game, so I didn't want to mess it up. When I moved on to the shading of the body, I tried to add some textures in the clothes here and there, plus some sort of grain to the green leaf-like gloves and shorts that he wears. And once I felt satisfied with the colors, I tried grounding him more in his environment by adding a yellow rim light and adding his shadow to the trunk he's sitting on. When I felt like I couldn't add anything more to his character, I finally went back to the trees, and this time I was like, screw it. I simply lined them all one by one and basically repeated the same steps that I did for Skull Kid. So I did their line art, I added some flat colors, and then the shading, and then some steps later I added rim light also to help outline them in the environment. I also added subtle touches like the little peeking face in the tree at the top left, and some twirls here and there in the trunks, so they appeared a bit more stylized than regular trees. And finally, it was time to draw the sky. So drawing the sky was sort of an experiment once more. I simply applied layers upon layers of colored clouds, one on top of the other, blended them together and repeated these steps until it looked alright to me. I played with some layer adjustments to get the colors right too, and that was it for the sky. I did end up adding some final touches to the whole piece. I will go quickly through this step, but basically, when you think you're done, something I like to do is turn the image back to grayscale and see if the values are still on point. If not, I simply adjust the brightness and contrast quickly until it feels accurate once again. Now, here we are. Finally, after all this time, all this artwork, we are finally at a step where there is no more step, and we have our final result. Ultimately, I am more than proud of having been able to complete this piece, like at all. It was by far my biggest challenge to this day, and the only but I could think of is that I did the math regarding the total amount of time I put on this, and it took me no less than 35 hours and a half to make it from scratch. To think that I actually started it at the beginning of January and made a total of 17 drawing sessions, it's a bit insane to me that I really end up finishing it at all. Now, here's the comparison because, well, after all, this is a Draw This Again challenge, let's not forget. So, obviously, content like this is not going to become the norm on the channel, but I have no doubt that with time, my speed and technique will improve and making this kind of art will not seem so out of reach for videos anymore. In any case, thank you so much for watching, everybody. Leave me a like and drop me a sub if you like my content or if I manage somehow to teach you anything through this whole ordeal. But I'm dead. I'll see you around in my next video. Au revoir!